Hi everyone, I'm back this time with a review of James Herbert's debut book, The Rats from 1974. Before I get into the novel, can I just get the rant out of the way first? This is nothing you haven't heard from me before, if you've been following these videos on this channel. And it's about this pathetic, lazy cover art here. I mean, I even don't like to use the phrase cover art to describe this. It seems like an abuse of the English language to label this as any kind of art, because clearly what's happened here is someone in an office has knocked this up in 10 minutes on a computer. They haven't read the book, they have no idea of what it's actually about, and what we get is this bland, basically meaningless image. Now, by way of comparison, I don't have an earlier version of this novel, an earlier edition, but I do have an earlier edition from the good old days of one of the sequels to it, Domain. So by way of comparison, look at that, this picture of an ajar door, and compare it to this. This is by Gerald Grace. This is how it should be done. Now, Gerald Grace has very obviously read this book. It's clear that he's read it, because the artwork that he's come up with not only is a decent representation of the story, but it's also got a good grasp of the story's themes and ideas and symbolism and imagery, because, well, first and foremost, you've got the rats there, rendered with incredible detail, the razor-sharp teeth. You can't really see it here, but the detail in the feet, the legs, is incredible. This carpet of, rats. You've got the symbolism here, because the book deals with the total collapse of civilization, and that's been rendered with this clever image of the classical architectural structure, which is dilapidated, nuclear cloud there covering it. You've got the upturned car here, again, symbolism. Man's means of escape and fleeing has been literally upended and devoured by rats. It's just a powerful image that has been made with great care, great love, great attention to detail, great skill. It's art. It deserves the label of art, whereas this does not. And, publishers, you can't complain that your industry is dying, that people are no longer buying paperbacks and hardbacks, when you yourselves show such little care for your own products, so such little love. Don't even get me started on the modern practice of in England at least, of increasing the size of them. To explain what I mean there. So this is the size of a paperback back in the day, and this is a bloody size of them now. They've made it bigger. In England, I don't know how it is in America, I can't really show in this, but you get the idea. Why have they done that? It's because in England, this size, this format is associated with literature, with literary books. To give it, there's George Orwell's The Complete Essays of George Orwell, and it's the same size. So that's what they've done. And maybe I'll save that for another video where I'll just put all of my gripes into one video about the state of the horror publishing industry. But anyway, yeah, publishers, you've only got yourselves to blame for the state of your industry, in my opinion. Horror publishers, I mean. Anyway, on with the novel. Right, so The Rats, 1974, a game changer, a milestone in the genre. This was heavily criticized on publication for its very graphic depictions of violence, or at least at the time graphic. Nowadays, it's not all that shocking. It's similar to those video nasties of the 70s and 80s that were banned. You watch them nowadays and they're completely tame by comparison to what gets produced today. But looking through the lens of the history of horror, James Herbert's The Rats is really laid a lot of groundwork for what would come. It would be 1980 before, in my opinion, there was anything comparable to him, and that would be Richard Lehman in his debut novel, In the Cellar. Yeah, in terms of the story, not a great deal. I'm going to assume anyone watching this video has either read this book because it's so famous, or at least knows of it, or can take an educated guess at what it's about from the title. It is just about these huge mutant rats which terrorize London, and they, devour various people. The book shows signs of inexperience and naivety in its telling. It reads like a debut book. It's very episodic, very similar to Sean Hudson's debut, The Slugs. You've got characters will be introduced, we'll get a bit of backstory, and then they'll just be killed gruesomely by the rats, and that just happens again and again and again. There are some iconic set pieces in this book. There's a great scene that takes place in the London Underground. the London Zoo gets terrorized. There's a cinema that gets terrorized. Rereading this actually a few days back, I found myself wondering whether this book didn't influence American Werewolf in London, because that film also has iconic set piece scenes that take place in the London Underground, the London Zoo, a cinema, in the same order as well as this book. And yeah, I don't know, maybe John Landis read this and was influenced in some way by it. But and that film also concerns a creature from a different place being brought to London to terrorize the people. But anyway, so yeah, story-wise, it's good, it's decent, if a tad thin, and it's a very short book, 194 pages. There's a bit of padding in this book. It's it's very uneven in its pace. Some of the chapters are fairly brief, but then other ones, like the chapter towards the beginning with that crazy religious homeless woman, that nymphomaniac, that goes on really, really long. It's almost like a novel within a novel. It's an entire story arc told, and there's no real reason for it to be as long as it is, because it just ends up in the same place as all the other characters who get introduced and bumped off. But I think what's happening here is James Herbert, who did not have a history as a short story writer before he became a novelist. Most horror novelists learn their trade as short story writers, and then they take the jump to first novel. As far as I know, he didn't do that. He wrote very few short stories in his entire career. So this does read like a writer learning his craft as he goes along, and it's interesting. It's kind of fascinating to watch it, to read it through with that in mind. What I like about this book is the subtext. Now, that's not something I usually say, because for me, subtext, especially in horror, it should be there if you want. It should be subtext, it should be there if you want to delve into it, but it shouldn't be intrusive. A story, first and foremost, should be a story. And if a writer wants to get into big themes and ideas and metaphors, no problem at all, but do it skillfully, do it subtly, so that it doesn't intrude upon the narrative, on the story. Now, subtle this book is not in its theme. It deals with the government's neglect of the post-war generation in England. If you don't know about that, very briefly, the generation that fought Nazi Germany were promised by the government homes fit for heroes upon return, but what the country got was heroes fit for homes. The government just tossed them aside, as almost always happens. The governments are all too happy to label these people heroes when they're fighting, but as soon as they come back and they need a little help, nope, you're on your own. They just toss them aside. And they grew up in slums. Now, James Herbert himself grew up in that environment. And this is an angry book. This is a book, there is a character in it who's the stereotypical incompetent, bumbling, corrupt government official. We've got our working class hero, the teacher, who sees us through the narrative, and he basically represents James Herbert. He voices the ideas of James Herbert about, the government's neglect of the underclasses and the marginalized and the working classes. I could go on a lot about this idea, but what I'd like to say is that there's a very interesting difference between British horror of this time and American horror. You would get in English horror, you would get a lot of this, where these working class lads, such as James Herbert, Sean Hudson, Ramsey Campbell, they wrote about the horror of the streets, real visceral horror. Whereas in America, if you compare with the huge horror novels of the time from across the Atlantic, things like The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby, roughly the same period. That's a very different kind of horror. Their horror was all about these middle class couples who were being besieged by some external threat that was in no way their fault. If there was a fault in those books, it was about Judeo-Christian principles had been neglected, especially in, like I just said, Rosemary's Baby, where Rosemary is a lapsed Catholic, and The Exorcist, where it's Catholicism that saves the day. I'm not saying one is better than the other, it's just a cultural thing. The concerns of English writers in the 60s and 70s, very different to those of over in America. So, yeah, Sean Hudson's debut book, The Slugs, is also concerned with the working classes being tossed aside and left to rot and fester. This, Ramsey Campbell's debut, The Doll Who Ate His Mother, uses the slums of Liverpool as its background and is full of imagery and symbolism. So That's what I like about this book. I don't especially enjoy reading this because I go to horror for different things. I like atmospheric horror. I love James Herbert's later ghost stories, where I think Herbert was a master of the classically English ghost story, the spooky, chilling work that relies on suggestion, that relies on what is not seen, what is not described, what is not shown. You know, he really plays with the reader's imagination. Whereas here, he the leave your imagination at the door. You don't need it because he's just going to assault you with imagery and scenes, and he's going to tell you exactly what is going on here. I don't happen not to like this kind of thing, but of its kind, it is almost as good as it gets. And now and again, I do like to read this sort of thing. So, in conclusion, this is a book that I deeply respect, deeply admire, appreciate its position in the history of horror, but don't especially enjoy reading. It's not really for me, but I can't deny that it is a classic. It deserves to be known as a kind of modern classic of horror. When I say modern, I know it's almost 50 years old, but I'm talking about the whole history of the horror genre. So I think that's going to do it. And I've read 2 books over the last few days. And the next review, which will be coming almost immediately after this, is actually of one of the books I just mentioned from America, by way of comparison. So for now, I'll conclude this by saying James Herbert's The Rats is... I realize I've not said an awful lot about the actual book, but again, it's 194 pages. I read it in a couple of hours. And what do you really need to know in terms of the plot? Bunch of rats descend upon London, kill off a bunch of people. It is quite graphic. In the opening chapters of this, a newborn baby gets eaten alive by rats. And again, coming back to the publisher's decision to make this into something that it isn't, is this really a book that you need to be sanitizing and presenting as some kind of, I don't know, literary horror? It's not that kind of thing. This is a balls to the wall, in your face, gruesome depiction of violence and depravity. And there's a place for that. So, yeah, I mean, I'm sorry if you think I haven't said an awful lot about the plot, but there really isn't all that much to say. For me, the strength of this book is not the story, which is, I'll say again, thin, and the characterization is thin. It's the intent behind it. It's the passion and the anger that informed this book, and I respect it a lot for that. So there you go. Right, stay tuned, because my next review will be coming up immediately after this. Until then, thank you for watching this, if you did watch it to this point, and bye for now.